Chamocha. Learning about what does it mean that there's only God and what does it mean that God is the only thing that exists. A lot of the Maamar is going to focus on looking about the evolution of, it's not like an evolvement, it's the devolvement of how the physical world came into being, showing us all the different dimensions, and even still within all that dimension, everything is still within the Godness, and God's still above all. We're trying to make sure that we understand the conclusion. Yonatan ben Uzziel said, who is like you among the supernal beings, there's no one else beside him, Ein Milvado, and Uncle has said that there's nothing other than he, there's only God. And it seems not. It seems like we have a bunch of creation going on, which is also part of why we're going into all the behind the scenes of creation. We're going into all the upper levels of creation because it says in the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim, God created the heaven and the earth. But you just said nothing exists besides for him. So what's going on here? Part of what we're tracing by going through the origins of everything is to show you how everything's still, it all goes back to God. Even when we look at creation, it's still all going to go back to God. We're not free floating. We're not just here. We got here, and not just that we got here, but we're only still here because we're still tethered to God. The simple way of viewing that is the sun and a sun ray. You don't have a sun ray without a sun. And if there's no sun, the sun rays go away. So creation is like that. We're trying to understand that by looking into all the details of actually creation. Part of the understanding of that is to realize that we live in a physical world, but this physical world doesn't exist on its own. The physical world is not just like free-floating existence. It's actually still tethered and tied to its spiritual source. That kind of caught us up to the whole thing with the mazel, the flow of things, bringing us up to this idea of a blade of grass doesn't grow without a mazel hitting it and saying grow. And what is that? That's an angel. And the angels, there's a reflection, there's shared characteristics between a physical being and its spiritual source. When you have foliage that doesn't last very long, up above their source are also angels that don't stay in existence for very long. Versus things like grass or things that are continually in existence, these are angels, ministering angels that take care of the world. So these are angels that do stay in existence for a long time. That brought us, we looked at different aspects of creation as far as the four kingdoms of creation. Domain, the silent creations. Usually that's the mineral world. Anything where God is silent within it. We don't see growth or movement or speech or anything like that. So Melech, anything that grows, that's all plant life. That goes from a tiny little seed to majestic trees. That's why the angels, they could go from tiny little small to great significance. Especially if they're on a mission for God, they become like God himself. That's part of what we learned last time. Chai, the animals, that's life. We see life here. We see growth. We see movement. Madam very speaks, that's man, because we could communicate outside of ourselves. Communicating ideas and expressions. That's also the epitome of man, is to go outside their own self. We got into this whole thing about the rooster. We're talking about there's a rooster crow that's down here in this world. And what does that reflect up above? First of all, we have versification. This is from King David, said this in Tehillim. At midnight, I rise to give thanks to you. What wakes us up at midnight? The rooster. The rooster crows. The rooster doesn't want to crow. It feels like there's flames of fire beneath its wings. And that's why it crows. That's what Zohar says. Also, why is it midnight? Midnight is when one day turns into the next day. So that's why all this stuff goes down at midnight. That's when the switching over occurs. So, what's happening at midnight? Just to recap, the lowest realms, that's the rooster's crow. The rooster's crow wakes man up and it's like, hey, wake up and go praise God, etc. What's going up in the higher world, especially you get to these middle worlds here, you see like Yitzira and Bria, the formation, creation kind of worlds. That's when you have Malach Gabriel, the angel of Gabriel, is waking up the souls in the Garden of Eden. And he's like, time to study Torah, delight in God. Man was made to work the garden. What does work the garden means? To reveal godliness within the world. It also says that at midnight, God is mourning for the destruction of the temple. Angel Gabriel's waking up all these souls and being like, let's reveal God, let's celebrate and delight in God, etc. And God's like, oh, I'll go join them. That's going to bring me comfort to delight with these souls and revelations. And then the highest realms, that's the 5 severities of Bina, awakened Malchus. So if you look at the chartification, if we have versification, do we have chartification? So if you look at the chart, remember Malchus is all the way at the bottom there. So each of these 4 worlds, and worlds is merely like realms, each of the 4 spiritual dimensions has these 10. What we learned in Tanya's 10 soul powers, these are 10 ways, attributes of God communicating with the world. Each dimension has these 10 within it. So everything's very multi-layered. And then the 10 within the 10 within the 10, there's a lot going on here. But anyway, so these 10 exist within each realm. The bottom one is kingship, Malchus. Let's say all 10 of these are in the highest world of Atzilus. Atzilus is the beginning of creation. Remember when you have the sun and the glow around the sun? And only there can you actually start moving toward a sun ray? Atzilus is the closest thing to the sun itself, to God himself. Once you get above there, you're getting into like all the primordial stuff, and then it's God's essence, which is totally beyond comprehension and understanding, and it's just beyond creation itself. You've got all these attributes in Atzilus and Malchus. It just takes in. It's taking in the glow. It's taking in the light force, basically, because this is where creation starts from. So that's where the light, the force of creation is going to be over here. So it just takes it and takes it and takes it in. Then when nighttime comes, it goes down to distribute it to the next lowest world. Malchus is the lowest one, so that means it's the next step toward the next world, which actually then becomes the top of the world after it. The links in the chain. The bottom of one is the top of the next. Malchus goes, and then it's starting to go down again. It's like, wait a second, if this attribute is just going to keep going down and keep giving, it's not going to be able to recharge. So we need to go back up again. You distribute it, and now it's time to go back up. So what awakens it to go back up? In the highest realm, that's what the rooster's call is. That's the multi-dimensions of the rooster. We see that even when we talk about, this physical world that exists, and etc., 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 we're not this free-floating, freestanding world. There's actually these multi-dimensions that are all linked to each other. And ultimately, if you go all the way up to the top, it always goes back to God. God as he exists beyond creation. Because even these higher worlds are still all within creation. God created them to be the progression to the physical world. Even though these are things that are so beyond us, it's still all within the greater creation. Not until you get above all of these things that are just within God's essence, all of this becomes irrelevant there. Then these are two different places in Tehillim where it says, Ma gadol ma'asech Hashem, how great are your works, O Lord, and Ma rabu ma'asech Hashem, how manifold are your works, O Lord. So how great is talking about angels, they're such great and awesome creatures, and how manifold, that's talking about the particulars of all of creation. You didn't just create stuff, there's so much detail, there's so much to all of creation. Now, where does that all lead us to? We saw with the foliage, and we're seeing it now again with the rooster. The involvement of a spiritual entity is not enough to create a physical entity. As in, think about these 4 dimensions here, all the spiritual dimensions, even if you're going from these 5 severities, and then they come down to the next world, and the angel Gabriel in the next world, and that's the souls in the Garden of Eden. It's just the condensed form, it's just the reformed form of what came before it. That doesn't get us a physical rooster. Because as we've said, as we mentioned many times, physicality and spirituality, they're antithetical to each other. By definition, if something is spiritual, it cannot be physical, and something that's physical can't be spiritual. Spirituality has no time-space measurement. Physicality does. That's what makes it a material physical entity. There's some way of measuring it, of encapsulating it, feeling it, etc. Spirituality is not like that. We can't, here it is. We can't. Even if you go through these evolutions and you're going through this malchus, this kingship attribute, and the attribute manifests as an angel. You're just taking a spiritual entity and you're kind of reforming it for the next world. How do we get to a physical rooster? And this is kind of where the crux of everything is, and it's kind of one of the definitional aspect of belief in God and creation and all that kind of stuff, is that because the involvement of a spiritual entity is not enough to create a physical entity, ergo, physicality can only come about what we call yesh me'ayin. Yesh me'ayin means something from nothing, and subsequently remains dependent on its source. There's somewhere in this process that once this spiritual entity has been condensed enough that it's finally at the lowest that it can go as a spiritual entity, and it's still a spiritual entity even though we've condensed it so much, there's somewhere that a leap occurs. There's a jump that occurs that turns it into a physical being. Spiritual cannot be physical. That's part of how you can't have creation without God. Because we have all these spiritual entities, these spiritual worlds that we know, even though they're all within the realms of creation, but you can't make that leap without God making that jump and turning a spiritual into a physical. So that's what we call it, a something from nothing. Nothingness as in spirituality. Not just that there's no matter material there, but that there's no substance. And all of a sudden we have a thing that we can hold or measure, etc. This is from a sefer that's called Sefer Karim, written by Rabbi Yosef Albo of Spain, 1380 to 1444. I was telling my students, remember with the Hanukkah Maamar, we were talking about different things like assimilation. We've been here before. The whole thing was a spiritual war, and we've gone through this. I was doing a mini historical lesson for them of the 1900s to see how God has been surgically removed from everything, how intentional it was. And so the fact that we're here and people don't have meaning in their life, it didn't just happen. There's a cause and effect that brought us here. So one of the things I was trying to explain to them was any question that you guys have about Judaism has probably been asked before. And not just has it been asked before, it's probably been asked by someone much smarter than the rest of us. So go look, basically. First of all, don't feel like your questions are just being asked in a void. You have the flip side of it. You have these people who are they think they're going to ask the most genius question of how do we know, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, honey, take a number, stand in line, because that question has been asked before. But it's the other side of it. There's nothing wrong if you have the question, because these are questions that the greatest minds have asked and sincerely asked the question. Not just let's pontificate a little bit, but to really ask the question to try to find an answer that we can study and learn. But I hope it landed right for them to know that it's okay. There's nothing wrong with having the question. And not just that, but these answers are there. So go look. Here, we have this from this great Jewish philosopher. We could see how they figure out God, who's a spiritual entity, and we have a physical existence. How does this work? They take everything apart. They look through the whole Torah, etc., as much as a human mind can. And great rabbis are doing this. And these are the conclusions that they've come to. All signs are pointing in this direction. So, Amunis Sharai Lamin Kalbatar Moshe Shanim Shachas Lashashi Karim Enachnu Avapi Shanim Sharashim Elam Hinche. There are 6 dogmas which everyone professing the law of Moshe is obliged to believe. They're connected with the 3 fundamental principles that we laid down, but they're not derivative principles. What's one of them that he's going to mention here? Creation of the world, something out of nothing. According to Rebbe Maharash, this is a fundamental belief, a belief in the Torah, is that the world came something out of nothing. So we kind of understand this on a basic level, that if there's something there before, then does that mean that something pre-existed or predated God? What we're saying, there was only God, and then God initiated creation. If you don't say that, then you're allowing that something besides for God existed. Even when people get all caught up with evolution, we believe in creationism, evolution can't, or any sort of evolution can't occur without a driving force behind it. So if you say, oh, God was like guiding evolution the whole time, maybe, even though God gives us that account of creation. There's a general idea that the world has to come out of nothing. There can't be anything existing, or you're saying that something outside of God exists. And if God's not absolute, then what's our claim? So we have to start from God being absolute, and then we could try to figure out everything from it. I actually saw recently there's I don't know what the question was. I guess it was some scientific question, or maybe it was like a social kind of question. Someone was asking the Rebbe about it. So I only see the reply letter. We don't always get the letters that came in. And the Rebbe was talking about how we don't make conclusions and then try to apply our conclusions to reality. That is a very harmful existence. There is reality, and then we have to then try to figure out conclusions from reality. People reverse the process by this is the way things should be. Try to superimpose that. No, it's not, reality doesn't work. There's reality, and then you could extrapolate from reality. Right? We have to know which direction we're going in. Connection here is that God is absolute. Now that we know God is absolute, how do we get this physical world? We have to figure out how this all came to be. All the descriptions that we're going to have here is all based on there is only God. There's nothing that could have existed before or after. And that means if God brought existence about, did he just poof it into existence? Ta-da! Or is there a process? Part of the conclusion is that this perfectly ordered world has a perfectly ordered progression and a perfectly ordered system of creation. That means you don't just have a sun and then boom, and now we have heat on Earth. There's a process of sunlight moving away from the sun, moving through space, contorted into a sun ray in our atmosphere, and then coming down to a sunlight that we can handle. Spirituality and creation mirrors that sort of pattern. It's not just boom, things exist. This goes back also last time, that the light has to fit the vessel, or the vessel has to be able to take in the light. So for a physical world to exist and take in the light of creation, God's power of creation, what process needs to occur to create a vessel for this? And part of what that process is the condensing of spirituality to the point where now it's nuggeted enough, it's enough of a nugget that now we can make the leap. But that ultimate leap from spirituality to physicality, only God can make that leap happen. An angel can't make that leap. Nothing but God can make that leap. God does not leave the picture. Sefer Karim tells us that the creation of the world is something out of nothing. It's clear from its nature that it is a dogma common to divine law generally and belonging especially to the law of Moshe. So he's saying this is very specific. This is very clearly a Torah concept. Though it is neither a fundamental nor derivative principle, because we can't conceive a divine law in general, and the law of Moshe in particular, without the idea of creation ex nihilo, as we explained in chapter 12 of this book. But it may be likened to a branch issuing from the first principle, which is the existence of God. This idea of creation something out of nothing, it's not its own commandment number 4, creation is something out of nothing. Instead, this is something that branches out of God exists, the absolute existence of God. We explained above, and obviously this is pulled out, so we explained above that God is free from defects. Now, if he cannot create out of nothing, this would be a defect in his nature. The point that he's making as a philosopher is because we can conceive of this idea, that means that it must be true. Because we are oh, God's in absolute existence. That means the world came from God, etc. And God is absolute and perfect, and there's nothing that he can't do. Because we can think of it as, then it must be so. As in, it must be within God's capacities to make this happen. We cannot say that creation ex nihilo is something from nothing, is ipso facto an impossibility. That creation must be out of something. Because we only understand creation out of something. Bippity boppity boop. Table! Even Cinderella's godmother couldn't make a carriage without a pumpkin. Even she needed something to work with. None of us could create with nothing. We need a starting point. And if you're oh, we're going to make this chemical reaction that's going to change something, an alloy, that's all the alchemists. The ultimate thing is, how do you make gold out of anything? That's the secret formula they're all hunting. But you still are working with something. That's the joke of scientists are all right, God, we have figured out how to create a human being. We don't need you anymore. We got it all figured out. Okay, we're going to have a contest to prove that this is correct. Scientists are look, we know how to do this now. They go to start tracing man out of Earth, and God's no, go get your own Earth. So we can't do anything. We need a starting point. He's saying that just because we're nah, that's not possible, as in the physical realm is not possible, doesn't mean it's impossible for God. Because just the fact that we can conceptualize it means that God can make it happen. For since the mind can conceive it, it may be believed, and comes within the power of the omnipotent being. Even those who believe the eternity of the world admit that God, though a simple intellect, is the cause of all things. Therefore, Matter is caused by God through the instrumentality of the separate intelligence, which is also caused by God. But how can a separate intelligence be a cause of matter if there can be no coming into being ex nihilo? So there can be no greater creation ex nihilo than this. As in, the bottom line that it comes to is that just because we cannot in this world conceive of an existence that comes as something out of nothing, we could actually intellectually conceive it. That means for God it's possible. Not just that, but the creation of the world, starting from God, and all of a sudden we have this physical existence, is the greatest example of creation something from nothing that there is. Just to tell you where we're going next. We're returning to the verse about the snow, and we're going to look at it. We're going to break down the gematria of it. The next part is very exciting. It's going to be like, what does it mean that creation came out of the snow? God took the snow from under the throne of glory and he just threw it down. Like, what is that supposed to mean? And then after that, we'll see other parts of time and we'll see what that has to say about everything.